last kind of 20 minutes a bit about some of the emotions that I experienced on my journey here this morning. My journey here this morning started at about 5 a.m. because I've got quite young children. And then around 9 a.m. When I was trying to come up with this PowerPoint and the very young children were demanding my attention, I was beginning to get a little bit frazzled. So this is one of the emotions that I felt this morning. Quite a lot of stress and tension, combined with a kind of rictus smile. No, darling, I'll be there in a minute. You know, anyone who's got young children recognises this particularly unpleasant quandary. So that was one emotion that I experienced. Another one was on the tube on the way here. A woman had a very beautiful, fluffy dog that was very cute. And suddenly the whole tube carriage, I'm sure you've all experienced this, who were just, you know, looking down and not engaging with each other, were suddenly all looking at each other and smiling and patting this dog and having a lovely time. So that was another moment that I had. And then the third moment I had was I unexpectedly managed to arrive early. And so I sat in the beautiful Gordon Square where you've probably just been having your lunch. And from having been slightly anxious that I wasn't going to get here on time and that I was nervous and so on, I had a wonderful moment sitting in the garden where I felt like I could relax a little bit. Now, there's lots of reasons why I might have had these emotions this morning. Lots of explanations we could give. But as a historian, I'm quite interested in why I was primed to think about those emotions and why I was uncomfortable about some of them. So, for example, you know, I was frustrated and sort of slightly stressed trying to do my presentation. Why did I feel it was important to smile and appear to be relaxed in front of my children? I don't think I did it very successfully, by the way, but that's what I was aiming for. Why in the carriage, in the tube carriage, was I happy suddenly to pet the dog and to be quite childish, where only seconds before I had been trying to look quite severe and serious and look down at the thing that I was reading? And why did I gravitate towards a garden to relax? Now, of course, you know, trees and birds and things are lovely and relaxing things, but also there is an incredibly long history of gardens as places for restoration and for thinking and relaxation. So was part of my choice to go to that garden a sort of channeling of a long history? I think it is, and I think that when we experience emotions, what we're doing isn't just having knee-jerk reactions to the external world and to its stimuli, or experiencing a private psychological moment. I think what we're also doing, and what I'm hoping that I'll be able to persuade you today of and unpack and explain a lot more, is what I think we're also doing is participating in much broader cultural moments, that our emotions aren't just shaped by our internal experiences, but the cultures that we live in, the histories that we are part of, and all of those values and expectations that are part of those histories and cultures. So the first exercise that I want, the thing that I want to get us started on, and then we'll kind of keep coming back to it during the lecture, is I'd like you to just take a moment and have a think about an emotion or an emotional experience that you had either on the way here this morning or during the morning session or during your lunchtime, and just write down. I'm sure you will have had lots of them, but just choose one of them. You probably will be talking about this to one of your neighbours, so just to let you know that in advance. But I don't feel that you have to shy away from things that make you feel awkward and embarrassed. Like I said, you know, I had this sort of moment where I was very stressed and angry, and then having to sort of cover it up with to my children. I'm quite interested in those dynamics. So choose an emotion, have a think about it, and write it down. Okay, so it is it's quite a long talk. I'm going to just give you a little outline of what we're going to talk about, what we're going to do. So introduction, that's what we're doing right now. Part one, that's what we're about to do. So this is some basic principles of the field that I work in. Key question, what is an emotion? So we'll spend some time thinking about that. And then I will talk a bit about what the history of emotions is. So what does that discipline mean? What does that phrase even mean? And I'm going to look at two key examples, sadness and boredom. And then I'm going to think a bit about, because the topic for today is emotional intelligence, isn't it? That's why you're here. So I'm going to think a bit about why the history of emotions, which seems like rather a rarefied and strange thing to be thinking about, why is that relevant to emotional intelligence? Why do I think it's a kind of a very timely thing to be thinking about now? Then we'll have a break, hurrah! And then in the second part, we're going to just look in a bit more depth, in a bit more detail about the kinds of approaches that you might use if you do the history of emotions, and approaches that then I hope that you might be able to take into, I mean, assuming that you're not all burgeoning historians of emotion, that you might be able to take into whatever field that you're interested in, or even just to make sense of your own emotional experiences in the world that we live in now. So these are technical words, but I'll unpack what they mean. So emotionologies we'll talk about, and the example I'll be talking about there is cheerfulness, which is something that I think we all have to grapple with nowadays. Emotional communities, so we'll think about anger, and emotional styles, and I'll just talk a bit about some research I've been doing on Schadenfreude. And then in the conclusion, I'll just hopefully sum up what we've talked about, and just remind you why I think this is, even though we're talking about the past, why I think this is so important for the present. You'll need a pen and paper, we've discussed that already. Oh, and finally, anyone who wants these slides, they will be available. They just haven't been circulated in advance because of this morning's PowerPoint issues that I've already told you about. But they will be available. Okay. Right, what is an emotion? This is probably not the first time you've been shown this picture today. You had it yesterday?
At the beginning of it, yes.
So who's seen it? This is Pixar's Inside Out. Yeah, the beginning. Yeah, you've seen the key bit that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so sort of half of you. So for those of you who haven't seen it or don't know what this is animated film Pixar. Gosh, now I think it was 2014 or 2015. Is that right? Something like that. And this is a film. The central character is a girl called Riley, who is moving house. So she's moving from a city that she knows well to somewhere else. And but the main characters are in fact her emotions. They are in her head. This is disgust, fear, joy, sadness, and anger. So which one's anger? Red one. Which one's sadness?
Blue.
The blue one. Which one's joy? Yellow. Which one's fear? Fear's quite good actually, isn't it? Which one is disgust? Okay, right, there we go. That wasn't hard. So we all get the picture. So the main characters of these emotions, we see in a scene kind of about halfway through the film. I mean, it's a great film, by the way. I really recommend it. We see about halfway through the film that these emotions are in Riley's head when she is born. So when she's a baby, these same characters are in her head, but just sort of small baby versions of them. We also see that they're in everyone else's heads as well. You know, they're slightly different characters, but they're the same 5 emotions, the same colours, the same basic sort of format of emotions. And these emotions, the way they work is that things happen in Riley's world, and then the emotions all sort of scurry around and do stuff in her head, and that makes Riley respond and do other stuff. So this Inside Out, I think, demonstrates what I would call the classical or popular view of what an emotion is. So emotions are responses triggered by external stimuli. You see a bear, you feel frightened, you run. That's the classic example of what an emotion is. Emotional responses are hardwired. So remember, they're there in Riley's brain when she's born. They're evolved responses. We don't really get into that in Inside Out, but that's what we talk about today in terms of emotions. We've learned these responses over millions of years, and they protect us from harm. And crucially, they're universal. So everyone in Riley's world has the same 5 emotions. We assume, more or less, that everyone has the same kind of emotions and the same kind of emotional experiences. That's the sort of popular view of emotions that Inside Out demonstrates. And the third point is that however complex our emotional experiences are, because I'm sure we all have a lot more than 5 emotions, they're all formed out of this kind of core group, core building blocks. So for example, this morning, a bit stressed, you might say, okay, well, that's a combination of fear and what have I said? Excitement. Well, it could be all sorts of things, I suppose. But so these are three kind of key aspects of the inside-out version of emotions that I would say is a classical view of emotions. But what I'm hoping to persuade you today of, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who'll be talking today who would think this, is that these assumptions are just too simplistic, that basically they're not really giving us an accurate view of what an emotion is. So as you know from the introduction, when before I became a cultural historian, I was a theatre director, and actually at that time in my life, I thought I knew an awful lot about emotions because I worked with emotions all the time. You know, whether it was dealing with an actor's kind of, I want to say hissy fit, but maybe not. That's not an appropriate word. You know, sort of outburst, or whether that was sort of recognising when the rehearsal room was kind of losing steam and needed picking up. You know, I was dealing with emotions all the time, but more crucially, my job involved sort of translating emotions that were on the page in a play script and working out what they might mean to the audience now, today. So, for example, you know, looking at a Chekhov play and thinking, you know, this woman who says that she's going to die because she can't go back to Moscow, you know, what does that mean for us today? What does that mean for us in the 21st century? You can just hop on a plane. Or thinking about Antigone, who is, you know, defiantly buries her brother. You know, what is the anger? What is the defiance there? And how does it translate to the contemporary context? And I, at that time, thought that the defiance that Antigone felt and the anger or the frustrations that the sisters feel in the Chekhov were sort of timeless emotions, you know, that we could really understand them today, that those emotions just stretched across a huge swathe of time. And in fact, that was why we were watching these old plays, because they still spoke to us now. But I've completely changed my view about that in the last 10 years. So for various reasons, I went to go and do an MA and then a PhD. And while I was doing my PhD, I came across this thing called the Centre for the History of Emotions. And I thought that just sounded really cool. So I went along to one of their lectures. And I heard the person in the lecture talking about someone who I now know to be extremely important person in our field, Lucien Ferrer, and there he is in his deck chair in honour of the fact that we are not in our deck chairs today. So this person was talking about the dangers of retrospectively applying contemporary psychological frameworks, so things like depression or anxiety, onto people in the past. So Ferrer says this is one of the most insidious of all anachronisms. He says we should not assume we know what rage meant in Napoleon's time or what displaying it looked like. I thought that sounded a bit unlikely. I mean, surely anger looks the same across all times, but no, apparently not. He says there is an abyss between the abyss, I've put it in bold letters because it's such an important word. There is an abyss between the morals and sentiments of the men of that age and ours. So I was really taken with this idea, but I couldn't sort of get my head around it for quite a while. So I just want to talk a little bit more about what that abyss is and what it might look like. So here are some examples of that abyss. So in the 3rd and 4th centuries, in the Sinai desert, there were groups of monks, solitary monks, who lived in sort of caves, and they described those. They wrote about it themselves, but also those who sort of looked after these communities wrote about it in quite a lot of detail. A very unnerving sounding emotional experience. It only happened at around between about 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the middle of the day. And they experienced a sudden sort of overwhelming lethargy and sorrow. And sometimes that sorrow would turn to anger and rage and frustration that they were here in the desert at all. Now, some of these monks would be so badly afflicted by this emotional experience that they would leave and they'd try and run back to Constantinople or wherever they'd come from. And sometimes they would die because they were in the desert and they were completely not being looked after, or they'd be, fall into all sorts of difficulty situations. Some of them killed themselves because they were in such deep despair. So just for those 2 hours. Now this emotional experience is called acedia, or akadi, sometimes it's described as. And it seems like it might be a sort of version of some combination of sunstroke and depression or something like that today. In fact, that's what people seem to think it is today. But actually, when we kind of really dig into what this emotion is, it's quite clear that it doesn't map directly onto a contemporary experience. So, for example, there were very powerful physical symptoms for those who had acidi. They would experience their limbs to be very heavy and kind of floppy and dragging. They would get terrible headaches and sort of dizziness. But they would also get this strange sense that of sorrow that they believed was sort of implanted in their minds by flying demons that were sent from the devil that were kind of going to inflict them with this terrible emotion. Now, acedia was one of the most important emotions for those communities, and also for religious thinking at this time. Before there were 7 deadly sins, there were 8 evil thoughts. And acedia was one of the 8 evil thoughts. It was, in fact, the evil thought that got dropped in the Renaissance when you start getting the 7 deadly sins. So this is an emotion that was extremely important, but I don't know if anyone here heard of it before? So we don't use this word before, and people haven't heard of it now. So that's an example of an emotion which has disappeared. Here's another example. In Troilus and Cressida, there's the Chaucer poem, the 1380s, pretty old. Troilus accuses Cressida of being unfaithful to him, so they are lovers. And then he's so appalled at what he's done that he faints. He says that he faints in dismay. I can't really read early English, so I'm not going to try, but I'll just give you the translation. His heart was gripped with sorrow, sorrow, and down he fell suddenly a swoon. So he suddenly faints from dismay and from sorrow. Now that is strange because I don't know if you know who Troilus is, but he is a knight. He's a brave man. So the idea of a soldier now, or like Jason Bourne or someone fainting from dismay seems really bizarre. But at that time, this great hero, immortalised in this poem, does faint from dismay. And he's not the only one, by the way. Lots of knights in this period faint from strong emotion. So this is very peculiar. So an emotional response that we think, a physical response that we think it must be involuntary seems to be completely different in the past than it is in the present. No one really faints from dismay anymore. Arnaud Daniel, so he's a troubadour in the late 12th century. He's a beautiful poet. I really recommend him. Anyway, he has a poem where he talks about yawning because he is so much in love with a woman. So yawning as a sign of love. Day long I stretch all times like a bird preening and yawn for her. And he isn't the only one who yawns out of love in this time. Isn't that peculiar? I don't think anyone here has ever yawned out of love. So again, a sort of involuntary response that you think couldn't really be affected by the cultures that we live in, suddenly is. So people are having different responses because they live in a very different culture. Finally, in the 19th century, I don't know if you've heard of this story before, but nostalgia, which today means a kind of longing for a sort of lost past. Until the end of the 19th century, nostalgia was described a kind of very severe form of homesickness. And it was so severe that it could kill you. And in fact, it did often kill people. The first people that were thought to be suffering from fatal nostalgia were soldiers again, actually, Swiss mercenaries who were fighting abroad in the 17th century. And it was said that as soon as they heard the sound of cattle bells, or anyone sang a song from their home country, they would fall into these terrible sort of stupors and become kind of really depressed and really confused. And again, some of them killed themselves, some of them deserted and were killed. So this was a very serious sort of emotional response, and it was all about longing to come back home. People during the American Civil War are discharged because they have nostalgia. It's because the only known cure is to be sent home. So if you have nostalgia during the Civil War, you're going home. In the First World War, people are also diagnosed with nostalgia, i.e. it's appearing on death certificates. We think the last person who died of nostalgia died in 1919. So he was an American soldier fighting in France. So how is it possible that you could die from nostalgia 100 years ago, but today you not only don't die from nostalgia, but you also don't die from homesickness. I mean, homesickness doesn't appear on your death certificate. You might well have died from homesickness, but that's not what's going to appear in the official language. So how did these changes happen? How does acedia disappear? How do people faint in the 1380s? Brave men faint out of dismay. Why do people yawn for love? And how did people used to die from nostalgia? So those are the kinds of, this is the abyss, I think, that we're talking about. So are we coming up with a slightly different version of emotions here then? Is it possible that emotions are not just inside out, like the film, but outside in? Something about the cultures that we live in, the air that we breathe and the environments that we live, change the way our emotions work and how we respond. To changing social expectations and political regimes, religious beliefs and medical ideas about what even an emotion is shape then our emotional responses. So today we think a lot of emotions sort of happens in the brain, don't we? In the Renaissance, people thought that emotions, I'll go into this in a bit later, were caused by humours and the imbalance of strange liquids and fumes in the body. Completely different vision of what causes what were then called the passions. The word emotion doesn't really get invented until the early 19th century. That's to demarcate a completely new way of thinking about love and sadness and anger. The emotions was a new sort of scientific word to describe the physiological responses of the body. And if it's possible that emotions can change because of the environments and the societies we're in, then what does this mean an emotion is? I think emotional responses are shaped by, as you probably gathered, I think that they're shaped by both our biologies and our cultures. So they are the beliefs that we hold affect the bodily responses that we're capable of and the way the experience that we have of our emotions. One thing I think is really worth recognizing is that emotions are capable of change and sometimes very rapidly. So when we talk about emotions being evolved, we're talking about millions of years, but we're talking about much smaller chunks of time. We're talking about several hundred years, even 50 years. The idea that there are some universal basic emotions that are timeless, that probably needs rethinking, right? Because there are so many emotions which seem to shift across time. I want to sort of have a little digression to think a bit more about these basic emotions, because this is something I get asked about quite a lot, and I think it's a really important point. So the idea that there are just a sort of handful of basic emotions, so cardinal emotional states, out of which all of the kind of complex edifice of our emotional responses are created, that idea is a very old idea. So it appears in Aristotle. It appears in the Li Qi, which is an ancient Chinese encyclopedia. We get it in Hobbes in the 17th century. But the modern version of this idea, so the version which the Pixar film is leaning on very heavily, comes from a guy called Paul Ekman, who, has anyone heard of Paul Ekman? Yeah. So I'm sure he'd be mentioned today as well by others today. So he used to be a sort of an anthropologist who was interested in emotions. Well, he is an anthropologist who was interested in emotions, but he kind of turned evolutionary psychologist and was really interested in looking at emotional facial expressions, and he used photographs and showed these photographs to people all around the world, and concluded that there were really only a handful of emotional expressions that were shared all around the world. And from this, he concluded that there were some basic emotional expressions and states. So that, and the emotions that he saw to be basic at that time were disgust, anger, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. Other psychologists since Ekman have kind of played around with this list a bit. You know, you get some people saying, oh, there's only 2 basic emotions, and then others saying, oh, well, there's at least 10. But this is one of the lists. Historians like me and other anthropologists of emotions, sociologists of emotion, kind of take Ekman to task quite a lot for several reasons. One is that there is a growing body of work which suggests that the photo experiments that Ekman used were very Eurocentric. There are several experiments that suggest this. There's a philosophical objection to Ekman as well. Is a facial expression an emotion? Is it the same thing? It might be that the muscular expressions look very similar, or in fact perhaps even are identical, but does that necessarily mean that the felt experience of the emotion, the lived experience of the emotion, is the same? And the final issue with Ekman is that language, there's a growing body of research which suggests that language has a very important role in shaping how we understand emotions and how we experience our own emotions. So the Ekman model is based on the classical view that emotions are trigger response. You know, you eat something disgusting or you smell something disgusting and you make this kind of face. But actually, there's a lot of research that suggests now, and again, I'll add the references to the slides later, that suggests that if we don't have the word or the category disgust, then we may in fact not recognize those facial signals as being part of a distinct emotion. And that's quite an intriguing prospect. So there's actually been research done on people who have sort of aphasia and sort of losing sense of words. But there's actually a better experiment where you know when you repeat a word over and over and over again and it loses all meaning. Well, so these scientists showed people the Ekman, the 6 photographs. So they showed them sort of 20 or 30 photographs and asked them to separate them into piles, and they all came up with a pile of the Ekman 6. Does that make sense? Yep. And then they asked the participants to say over and over and over and over again, disgust. And so they did. And then they were asked to sort the photographs again. And do you know what? Most of the participants sorted only 5 piles. They put disgust in with anger. And that was really intriguing, that things that we think are distinct and discrete bodily responses, in fact, seem to rely a great deal on our ability to categorize with words. And of course, words, language, is where culture really comes in. So we're almost at the end of this what is an emotion section. You'll be glad to know. So the ideas we have about emotions shape how we experience them. We label and categorize our vague bodily sensations with emotion words and concepts. Those categories are freighted, so they carry with them all sorts of values and social expectations and knowledge. And then we have a very complicated back and forth relationship between these concepts and their bodily sensations. And we're trying to make sense of the bodily sensations and the experience that we're having with the outside world. And if you're interested in this kind of analysis, there's a really great neuroscientist called Lisa Feldman Barrett who has a brilliant book called How Emotions Are Made. And she's also done a TED Talk, and she's written a ton of stuff that's freely available online. And she really makes a very strong case that what an emotion is this amalgam of social experiences, language, and these kind of inchoate bodily, strange bodily sensations. And this really leads us to the point that I'm really going to make today, which is emotions, therefore, are not inevitable, but depend on changing cultural contexts. So I want to just go back to that emotion that you wrote down. And I just have a look at your piece of paper yourself, and I just want you to write down on one side of the piece of paper some of the bodily sensations that you might have experienced when you had that emotion. You might not be able to recall them exactly, but what are the bodily sensations that you think are connected with that emotion? Just 2 or 3. And then on the other side, I want you to write down some of the values that you associate with that emotion. So, for example, I ought not to be bored. I should be more cheerful. I don't know. It's wrong to be cross with your children. Maybe I'm embarrassing myself by looking childish with this dog. Does that make sense? Okay, I'll give you just a minute or 2 to do that. So fear, what are the physical sensations associated with fear? What's that? Sweaty palms. Raised heart rate. Dry mouth. Trembling. Paralysis, yes, that's a great one. Or the urge to flee, so it kind of goes both ways, doesn't it? Any others? What's that? Whirlwinds, yes, great. Okay, so very strong physical sensations. Out of interest, what would you say the sensations are around excitement? Same. Okay, so just by way of final illustration, so you're having some of those sensations and you're a New York trader on the stock exchange floor, you might think you're having good stress or adrenaline, or you're just before an exam. Those sensations you might interpret as being kind of almost positive. You're going to have an edge. If you're a 13th century Christian and you're kneeling in a cold chapel on your own at 4 a.m. or something awful like that, you might get those sensations and believe that you are experiencing something called wondrous fear, which meant that you were in the presence of God. This is an amazing thing to experience if you're a 13th century monk. Or if you're a Pintupi who live in Australia, you might think that you are experiencing, with those same sensations, you might think you're experiencing something that's called Ngulu. Now, they have, I think, 15 different types of fear they distinguish between. And Ngulu particularly is one where the fear of realizing that your enemy is plotting their revenge on you. So you might think that you're experiencing that emotion. So some of those might be quite positive feelings. Some of them might be quite negative, for example, the poor Pintupi. But if you ignore these differences, these shades, then you're going to lose a great deal of what an emotion is. It's when you put those categories and those names onto an emotion that you start to understand what the sensation is that you're feeling. It's not just a physical sensation, but also the lived experience of that emotion. I'm going to talk in this section in a bit more depth about the history of emotions and what we do. What do we study? What materials do we use? How can you tell about emotions in the past? You might already have figured that answer that out. What is it that we're trying to determine? And the absolutely crucial question, why are we bothering at all? And I'm going to talk about this in relation to 2 examples, sadness and boredom. So this here is a picture of Margaret Cavendish. She was a philosopher, the Duchess of Newcastle. She's the author of Philosophical and Physical Opinions that was written in 1655. And she was called by Pepys mad, conceited, and ridiculous for daring to be a woman writing a book like this. Now, I don't know, in fact, how well you can see this. Maybe you can't at all see her face. Sorry, it's not a very good picture here. You're just going to have to take my word for it. She looks pretty miserable on this picture. Pretty miserable. If you think about author pictures nowadays, people are usually looking fairly cheery, but she looks pretty miserable. And I don't think that was because she had been attacked by Pepys. Why did an author at this time want to look so sad? Well, I think there are several reasons for this. In 1539, a writer, a lawyer actually, called Thomas Eliot, published what was then called a regimen, but nowadays we might think of as a self-help book, The Castle of Health. And in it, he advised his readers to practice being sad. It wouldn't fly in today's self-help market, would it? He gave them lots of reasons why they should be sad. You know, imagine, for example, your children disappointing you. Imagine your spouse disappearing off. Imagine losing your job and all of your worldly possessions and so on. So he gave readers all these kind of terrible reasons why they might sort of cultivate a moment of feeling sad. And he thought it was really important to feel sad a lot. And one of the reasons why he thought it was important to feel sad, and he wasn't alone in thinking this, was because the more familiar you were with sadness, with the practice of sadness, then when something really bad did happen to you, as it inevitably would do, as it inevitably does, you would be able to cope much better. You'd be more familiar with it. Actually, I think it's really clever and probably something we could learn from today. So we already have at that time this notion that feeling sad might be good for you. It might be a useful thing to do. We also have at this time something called the cult of the melancholy genius. So Marsilio Ficino was a mid-15th century scholar, and he was rather sort of somber and melancholy of his own disposition. And he rooted through the works of Aristotle, and he found that Aristotle believed that very clever men were prone to melancholy. And he really latched onto this idea and sort of really was foundational for what became a kind of Renaissance cult of the melancholy genius. So he wore black, he looked somber all the time, and he appeared to have these terrible sort of visions that were caused by an excess of melancholia. So this is the third point here. There was also at this time a very different view of what caused sadness to the view that we have today. We might talk about chemical imbalances in the brain and so on. The view at this time stemmed from the Hippocratic medical theory, so ancient medical theory, that believed that in our bodies are four kind of strange fluid type things called humours. They were kind of fluids. There was blood, choler, phlegm, and something called black bile, which is also called melancholy. And if you had, everyone had these four humours in their body, but everyone had their own individual balance of them. So some people had a bit more melancholy than phlegm, and that would mean they were more dispositionally sad. But there was a crucial thing. If you had more melancholy, and then you had a very sort of serious and dramatic thing happen to you, you know, one of your children dies, or your boat sinks or something, then it was believed that the melancholy would be heated up in your stomach. This was the view of the time, and that it would send kind of strange vapours into your brain, and these vapours in your brain would cause really strange visions. And it was these visions that was the explanation for the melancholy genius, because the melancholy genius would see things in a very poetic but also prescient sort of way. They'd be able to sort of predict the future and so on. So this idea of the melancholy genius was partly a sort of act of vanity on the part of this particular scholar, but it was also rooted in a Renaissance medical theory of the time. This is why we also get the Robert Burton's brilliant Anatomy of Melancholy, because he's talking about both himself as a melancholy genius, but also trying to understand why he's become like that. So there are already a few reasons why Margaret Cavendish might have looked quite sad in her author picture. The last one was a much more religious explanation. So one of the things about the black bile, the melancholy, was that it was thought to be very heavy and kind of thick and viscous, a bit like tar. And so it was thought to, if you had more melancholy than most, it was thought that it would weigh the body down, you know, that you would be heavy and you would walk slowly. And you would sort of, because you would walk slowly and be heavy, you would be quite slow and somber. And this was thought to be a very good thing. The fact that you were sort of lower down, closer to the earth, to the humus, meant that you were more humble. And that was a very important idea in this age of Christian religion, because being closer to earth and being humble meant that you were more dutiful and more obedient. It also, because you were slow, it meant that you were quite dependable, and that was a very good thing. You know, these happy people are very flighty, you know, they're not to be trusted. You know, melancholy people are the ones that you rely on. So sad people were good bosses, they were good spouses and parents. They played really important roles in communities. These are all of the things that we attribute to happiness today, of course. But at that time, sadness really was the emotion that you wanted to cultivate. So for all sorts of different things intersect, and sadness becomes a very desirable emotion in the 16th century. Why is it important to know that? Well, I mean, one reason is it gives us a great insight into the mind of the past. So, for example, you'll probably remember the line in Hamlet where his mother accuses her of wearing but the suits and trappings of woe, or I probably misquoted that, but so she gets annoyed with him and says, "Oh, you're just posing." And I think for most of us we think, oh, what she means is he's pretending to be more sad about his father than he really is. But that's probably not what she means. What she probably means is you're just hanging around like one of those annoying poets who's all dressed in black and thinks that they're a genius. Stop it, you know. So it gives us some insight into the texts and the ideas of the past. It allows us to understand them a bit more deeply. So that's one reason why that's useful. Another reason is it helps us understand, as historians, it helps us understand how people leveraged their emotions in order to get power or to affect change. So there's Margaret Cavendish. She's been insulted, humiliated, dismissed by all of the intellectual men of her age. And so she presents herself as a very serious scholar, as someone who's incredibly sad. And that so she utilizes that emotion in order to kind of make herself seem like someone that should be taken seriously. So we can see then, we start to understand how emotions work to create, to give people power and positions of authority in a society. But the third reason, and possibly the reason why this might be most useful for all of us here today, is that it reminds us that the values that we attach to emotions are not natural and inevitable and fixed. You know, I mean, even today there was an article, I think it was either The Guardian or the BBC website, Paul Dolan's new book about happiness. You know, the assumption is, well, obviously we all want to be happy, duh. You know, of course, happiness is the desirable emotion of our times. And so he was giving us some reasons why married mothers are less happy than married fathers and so on. And it was interesting stuff. But it's not the case that everyone desires happiness. It's certainly not true that everyone's desired happiness across time. Only a few hundred years ago, self-help authors were urging people to be more sad. Actually, if we look across different places, we also find that some cultures don't particularly valorize happiness in the same way as our culture does. The Ifaluk of Micronesia, there exists, in fact, a journal of happiness studies. That's how I know this. The Ifaluk of Micronesia think that overexcitement and showing off and failure at doing one's duties is what happens when someone appears to be happy, so they avoid happiness. So it's very important, I think, for us to remember that the values that we connect with emotions today haven't always been there, aren't always there for all people at all times. Because if we remember that those change, then we can think about why we've come to adopt these particular values for ourselves now. And we can think about what's at stake with us adopting those values now. And we can really crucially think whether we still want to have those values and whether they are actually working for us or whether they seem to belong to an outdated way of thinking or someone else's agenda. So here's another example to flesh that idea out. This is boredom. Actually, before we do this, I just want to think about some new emotion coinages. So we invent, don't we, new words for emotions. Can anyone think of any? FOMO, yeah, that's always the first one that comes into my mind. FOMO. Any others? YOLO. YOLO. Yeah. There's one I read over the weekend, Fligskum. I don't know, are there any Swedish speakers here? No, good. Okay, flinkscum, let's say it said like that. That is the shame felt at flying, the shame of flying in a plane. Any other new emotions? I don't think that's that new. What's fugged?
Fugged is the feeling of being snubbed by someone looking at their phone.
Oh, that is brilliant. F-U-G-G.
F-U-B-B.
Oh, fubbed.
Like snubbed.
Oh, you learn something new every day, Dave. That is brilliant. Okay, fubbed is a good one. Love it. Wrap rage, I get that quite a lot. So that's when you get an Amazon parcel and you just can't open it because it's got that plastic stuff around it. Any others? Okay, anyway, you get the gist. We're inventing emotions all the time. Fubbed comes into existence because of phones, right? I mean, it just couldn't, that emotion couldn't exist before then. Fligscam or whatever it's called, wouldn't exist without all the anxieties around the environmental impact of flying and so on. So the Victorians, they invented boredom. So that was their fabbed. So we had, at that time, we had people saying, I feel bored. That had been knocking around for about 50 years. But in 1853, we think the first example of the word boredom being used as a noun comes from Charles Dickens' Bleak House. So this is Lady Dedlock, who suffers what he calls the chronic malady of boredom. He calls boredom the misery of our age, the chronic emotion of our times. So he thinks boredom sort of defines the Victorian spirit, which is really intriguing. So the word boredom, it comes from the French bourre, meaning to stuff, to be fed up, literally to be fed up. And we think that the reason why the Victorians bothered to invent a new category of emotion called boredom is for several reasons. One is that in the 19th century emerges a very new relationship to time. So it seems to be the case that before the industrial age, people were working and living in small communities and often in the same house. And so you wouldn't really have a very clear demarcation between what was work and what was leisure time. It was just all work and then going to sleep. So you didn't really have a bit of the day which was free time. But in the 19th century, with the growth of cities and with the growth of a slightly regulated sort of work environment where people would go to factories or go to offices and then come home again, and with a certain amount of legislation too, we start to get a portion of the day which is free time, which is leisure time. And Victorians, being Victorians, were very keen that everyone used this leisure time in the most productive and useful, self-improving sort of way that they possibly could. So as you all are here today on your Sunday learning about emotions, so the Victorians took themselves off to lectures and galleries and seminars and so on to make sure that they used this leisure time profitably. There was an awful lot going on in Victorian London, circuses and fairs and exhibitions and theatre and so on. So to admit then, in the face of all of this, that you had spare time and you were not using it profitably and usefully and you weren't being diverted, began to seem like a sort of personal failure on your part. For the middle classes, that is. So the middle classes started to not really want to talk about being bored. At the same time, the medical establishment sort of swoops in and really demonises boredom in this time. No one's really interested in boredom before, but suddenly in the mid-19th century, doctors are talking about how boredom results in alcoholism, excessive masturbation, serious issue for Victorians. So this is the major issue. Politicians then jump on the bandwagon and say, boredom creates this misery in the slums. The slums actually create the conditions for contagious boredom, people say. They link boredom and poverty. They link, obviously, boredom and unemployment. And also feminists in the 19th century link boredom to upper-class women, like Lady Dedlock. So you have George Eliot in Daniel Deronda saying, Gwendolyn, the main character there, she's a real adventurous spirit, and she says, women are brought up to look pretty as we can be and dull without complaining. And she says that women get bored to death And that's why the pretty hothouse flowers become poisonous, she says. So there's this real sense that boredom is very dangerous, very corrosive. And why does that matter? Why does it matter that the Victorians had developed this very sort of strong aversion to boredom? Here, I just want to have a little moment to reflect on what the kind of materials we might then look at as historians of emotion. What are we turning to? We're looking at words. We're looking at new emotional categories and how words change their meanings and when new words become invented and when other words sort of disappear. We're looking at changing social structures, so leisure time gets invented. We're looking at new technologies and practices, so for example, mobile phones or flying or the invention of the public lecture. We're looking at self-help books, like that Castle of Health book which recommended being sad. We're looking at political speeches, medical and psychological writing, and of course, literary representations and images. And that's not all. We look at lots of other stuff as well, but those are some of the key things that we draw on to kind of create these histories of emotions and try and understand how emotions change across time. And crucially, why does it matter? So earlier we discussed one of the reasons why it's useful to understand about the history of emotions is that it helps us understand the mindsets of the past. It helps us understand how people use emotions to get power or to assert power over other people. For example, the politicians telling poor people that they were bored. It allows us to understand that values that we have about our emotions are not inevitable. It's not obvious that happiness should be desirable. But history can also help us understand how we have arrived at contemporary expectations about emotion. So for us historians, the 19th century is very recent. We think of that as being basically yesterday. And I'm really aware of a certain anxiety and moral condemnation that we have around boredom now. And that does still shape our experience. So for example, I did a panel discussion with a colleague who's a scientist, and I said that we were talking about the emotions of our research, and to play devil's advocate, but also to be true, I said, as a historian, we do sometimes get bored. We're in the archive for a very long time. You don't find anything for a long time. It's usually when you are bored that your brain sort of goes off and you have a little reverie or a daydream and you sort of hit on a really great idea. So I was saying boredom is a really important part of my practice as a historian. And then she did her speech and she said, to be honest, anyone who says that they're bored is doing the wrong job. And so I was really shamed in that moment for saying that I was bored. But it was also very clear that there is a lot of moral condemnation about boredom today. I don't think she's right, by the way. So we live in an age where we have these boredom-busting technologies, mobile phones and so on. And there are calls, of course, to reclaim time, the value of boredom, the possibility of allowing your mind to wander, the daydream, and how important those are for creativity. So it's clear that boredom is a conflicted sight. It's a difficult emotion for us now, as it was for the Victorians. But the key question for me is, do the conditions and the moral universe that the Victorians applied to boredom, is that still relevant for us today? We need to examine our own relationship with boredom in light of that historical question. What I'm going to do here is introduce you to a few key approaches in the history of emotion that have been developed over the last 30 or 40 years, and some key terms. So emotionology is a pretty key term for us historians of emotion. So emotionology is associated with Peter Stearns and Carol Stearns. They're a married couple who wrote one of the sort of earliest emotions of historians of emotion. And they described emotionology as the attitudes or standards that a society or a group within that society maintains towards basic emotions and their appropriate expression. So boredom is bad, sadness is good. And also the ways that institutions reflect and encourage these attitudes in human conduct. So, for example, Margaret of Cavendish putting that portrait of her in her book, or how a law court would encourage certain kinds of emotions and punish other kinds of emotions, or how courtship practices are expected to go. So he uses or they use the example of courtship practices expressing the valuation of affect, which is the sort of academic word for emotion, in marriage, or personal workshops as reflecting the valuation of anger in job relationships. So this is an emotionology is a sort of set of rules, essentially, that govern the emotions that we are allowed to show, but also those that we are expected to feel, and we sort of internalize those rules. So how do we know what an emotionology is? How do we detect an emotionology? So we're looking at ideals and conventions here. So Stearns, they looked mainly at middle-class advice manuals. That was their main source of emotionologies. They were looking at parenting manuals quite a lot, and they looked at self-help books. They looked at manners. This is a much earlier example of that kind of approach. They looked at the rules of social rituals. So actually the Stearnses didn't so much look at those, but people subsequently have. So they've looked at how a marriage is conducted, or how courtship happens, or funerals happen. People also look at technologies. For example, the moment when children are thought to be so nervous of sleeping in the dark that there must be an electric light in the room. That's a relatively recent thing that can be dated back to the 1920s. We look obviously at medical and psychological advice, legal categories, as we've talked about, and representations in films, novels, artworks, and so on. So this is how you might detect an emotionology. Here is an example of one. This is from my research. So cheerfulness. This is something that we all labour under, I think, today. Or I know certainly we do in universities, the sort of having to appear cheerful and upbeat all the time. So this really can be dated back to the beginning of the 20th century, when industrial psychologists kind of start appearing in factories for the first time. This is about trying to manage workplace unrest in a very critical moment and to increase productivity. And these psychologists conclude that people being more optimistic and being more positive gets better results. So then they start to test potential employees for these emotional qualities. So by the 1930s, 30% of American companies had industrial relations departments which were overseeing hiring and testing employees for introversion and other temperamental deficiencies. I don't think I would go down very well with that. So we're looking at hiring practices, but also self-help literature. In the middle of the 20th century, we got probably one of the most famous self-help books of all time, Dale Carnegie's How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, 1948. So he's talking to salesmen, and he's saying salesmen should always be upbeat, vivacious, having a cheery smile. And he even says, don't worry if you don't feel cheerful, just, fake it till you make it, essentially. That's his motto. So people are reading this stuff and internalizing this. Also, it's represented in art at the time. So Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller. We see this sort of man totally alienated from the corporate sales culture, which insists that he should be upbeat and cheery and so on. And we start to see that cheerfulness equals success. And a very interesting study done by a sociologist called Arlie Russell Hochschild. She worked with flight attendants, and she noted that, and I'm sure you've all had this experience, that flight attendants have to be what she called nicer than natural. They had to be really excessively lovely to you. And she called this emotional labour. These women, because it was all women, were having to perform this very sort of strong and almost caricatured sort of cheerfulness and sort of pleasingness in order to make their customers feel happy and content and looked after and so on. And she suggested that this caused a terrible disconnect for the flight attendants between the sort of emotions they were performing and how they actually felt, as you can imagine. So there's an example of emotionologies. We absorb the emotionology, and then we put it into practice because we've been reading the advice manuals, and it sort of becomes a natural form of expression. Partly because we desire to conform, partly because we repeat and copy one another, This is known as emotional practices amongst historians. And just because we sort of absorb the emotional temperature of the environments that we live in. That's what Hochschild is talking about. The longer a person lingers in an environment, the deeper those feeling rules become inscribed. There are issues with that kind of approach, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But one of the key strategies for thinking about how emotionologies are created is by thinking about something called emotives. So this again is another piece of technical jargon, but it's quite a useful one. What it says is that when we describe how we're feeling, that isn't simply describing a state of affairs like this stage is made of veneer wood. That's something that you can say is true or false. When we describe ourselves feeling an emotion, that's not a verifiable claim, but it is a claim that changes something in the world. So, for example, the famous example of this is saying, "I love you." You know, anyone who's said, "I love you," knows that this is not simply a description of a reality, but also it creates a reality in you. You feel so much more love when you say, "I love you." It makes that feeling more concrete. It brings it to the foreground. But also it changes something in the person who's hearing it. It changes something in the dynamic between you. So when we use emotion words, not only are we sort of bringing to bear this kind of whole emotionology, but we're also, then the words are changing the relationships that we have with other people, and sort of the idea that Reddy talks about, so he's the person we associate with these emotives, is that we sort of establish this emotionology in even stronger ways. The limitations of this kind of approach, obviously, you know, if you're just looking at advice manuals for the middle classes, are you sure that these emotionologies really apply to everyone? This is a top-down model. If a doctor tells you you should be avoiding boredom, does that really mean that everyone avoids boredom? I don't think so. It's probably unlikely. So we get these very monolithic then descriptions of the emotional character of an age. You know, if I say, well, everyone in the Renaissance walked around being sad, that would be a terrible over-exaggeration. We do get this idea of an emotional refuge, which I'm going to talk a bit about in a moment, which allows us to think about perhaps different ways that we could have different kinds of emotional communities running along together. So, having thought that perhaps the emotionologies was a bit too broad, people started talking about emotional communities. So the idea of emotional communities is that we actually have multiple emotional communities existing at once. They each have their own norms of values and expressions. Rosenwein, who's a medievalist, talked about monasteries and religious groups and the courts. But what sort of emotional communities can you think of that might exist today? Courts. The courts. Social media. Yes, that's a good one. Charity. Yep, charities. Yes, okay, yeah. Different kind of emotional bearing in a charity than in the tube station, yeah. You what? Families, yeah. And different families are different emotional communities, aren't they? The workplace, yep, absolutely. Okay, so we got the general gist of how this works. It's possible for us to be part of an emotional community and know the rules of engagement in that particular place, like I knew the rules of engagement in the tube this morning. So here's an example of an emotional community. Anger, expressing anger, usually in most cultures, and certainly in the early 20th century, generally frowned on. But here is an example of an emotional community that really encouraged people to express anger. The Synanon addiction rehab centers in California, and also the group therapy, primal scream therapy, and Kingsley Hall in the 60s, they sort of used the same techniques. So in the group therapy sessions here, participants were encouraged to kind of really goad one another until they lost their temper with each other, and these angry outbursts were thought to kind of sort of release whatever had been causing them to be ill in the first place, a sort of moment of the authentic self coming through. Now, you might not believe that this is useful today, but this is what they believed then. So here is an example of an emotional community kind of creating a new set of rules to allow people to experience and validate and value an emotion in a way that looks very different to how the sort of prevailing norms of their culture would have allowed people to be angry. So that's an example of an emotional community, but also, as I described before, an emotional refuge, a place where people can go to think about their emotions in a different sort of way. And the last, the limitations of this emotional communities approach. Do we have a choice? Do we have a choice in the emotions that we express then? I mean, this is in a sense the biggest question for emotions of historians of emotion. If you are absorbing these rules and regulations from either the culture at large with emotionologies or the communities in which you're part of, does it mean that you are kind of completely a cipher? You have no say in this matter? I, for one, think that doesn't really chime with how I experience emotions anyway. There's an example from Sarah Ahmed's The Promise of Happiness. I really recommend her as a writer. She's really great. And she talks about the feminist killjoy is the character that she writes a lot about on her wedding day. As a woman, you absorb an awful lot of stuff about your wedding day. It's going to be the happiest day of your life. You're going to love looking beautiful and like a princess and all of this stuff that you absorb and absorb and absorb. And then you might get to that day itself and feel a terrible sense of discomfort and disjunction because, in fact, it's not the happiest day of your life. In fact, you feel slightly embarrassed and like you've gone back on your principles, or maybe you're ashamed that you're wearing a white frilly dress, because your feminist friend is there and she looks really dismayed, whatever it is. So these sudden moments when you feel yourself to be out of kilter or sort of caught between two different emotional communities, what do we do in those moments? I think most of us in this room will have had those experiences where we're sort of we don't quite fit in one group and we don't quite fit in the other. In my work, I've become very interested in the idea of an emotional style. So I'm quite interested in the idea that we have multiple emotional styles that we are moving through in the day kind of quite freely and quite fluidly, maybe hundreds of times during a day. One of the writers who's really associated with this approach is Benno Gamel, and that's an essay that's freely available online. These emotional styles aren't necessarily linked to your identity groups. So, your feminist killjoy on the one hand and your bride on the other. They can also be linked to spaces, as you suggested, law courts, but also the workplace as a space as well as a set of people, the tube station, the street. They can be linked to sort of relationships that we have. My boss also happens to be one of my oldest friends. So we're constantly style switching. On the one hand, we're gossiping about, whatever's happened in our lives. And then we enter this kind of formal relationship to discuss, probation or something work-related. And I'm sure people recognize those style switching moments. And when we perform a certain style, that allows us to show connections with one group, but it also allows us to make a choice. And I think that's why it's an interesting possibility that we choose to associate with one group rather than another, that we choose to adopt a style rather than just have it foisted on us. I think we do absorb, of course, emotionologies, and we are part of emotional communities. But I think that the possibility of choosing a style, of choosing how to perform and how to act, I think possibly frees us up and allows us to have a bit more agency in our relationship with our emotions. So that's really just what I've just said. I think it's just a bit closer to our lived experience of emotion. I think we do feel, we do absorb and have ingrained in us a lot of emotionologies, but we also make decisions about which emotions we want to connect with at certain times. So my example of this, and this is the example I'll finish with, is Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is the pleasure felt in other people's misfortunes. And if you were sort of going on a strict Emotionologies account, so you were reading books, looking at newspaper articles and so on, you'd think that pretty much no one felt Schadenfreude in the 1930s. And the reason for this is because in the 1930s, anyone who wrote about Schadenfreude, who used this word Schadenfreude, used it in the context of telling everyone how terrible Germans were. This is a German word, it's a German emotion, people say. So why are Germans so brutal? Well, they have this word Schadenfreude, we don't have it in English, they're terrible, we're great, they're the enemy. You know, I mean, it's just so that this, you get the emotion allows people to create this moment of conflict, and reframe this conflict. So that's what you'd think then. If you were going on an Emotionologies account, you'd think, well, no one obviously felt then Schadenfreude. And obviously that's completely ridiculous. I mean, lots of people probably gloated over the misfortunes of their neighbours and so on. I would be quite interested in thinking about how people then adopted Schadenfreude and used it in very self-conscious ways. And I've been doing some work on drag queens and female impersonators in the 1930s who sort of picked up a kind of catty, sort of bitchy personality and used an awful lot of Schadenfreude in their performances, but also invited the audience to enjoy the misfortunes of others and enjoy the drag queen's own misfortunes at their expense. So they really played with Schadenfreude and they used it very deliberately and very purposefully. And I think that to me is an example of deliberately picking up an emotion and playing with it and talking back to the dominant emotionology and saying, actually, you know, we can do this emotion in different ways and we can make this our own. In the last couple of minutes of this talk, I just wanted to go back to your word that you wrote down. And you wrote down some of the sensations and some of the values attached to it. And now I want you to think about if you were trying to understand the emotionology associated with that word, if you were trying to understand the rules attached to that side that you wrote the values down on, if you were going to try and understand those rules and where they came from, what would you look at? Where would you go? So that's one question. And the second question is, are there different communities that allow that emotion to be performed or enacted or enjoyed or valued in different ways? So where would you go to find the emotionology? What are the different emotional communities, one or two that you can come up with that are associated with that emotion? I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, I think most of you have stopped writing now. I'm gonna assume that you have finished, and I'm going to ask you. We've got a few minutes left. Those of you who might be brave enough to call out the emotion that you've been working on and tell us where you'd go to understand that emotionology and the kinds of communities that might allow that emotion to be seen differently. So who's feeling brave? Yes, great. Yes, it does. And the confusion itself, did you feel, what were the values associated with that confusion? Is it an okay emotion to feel, or? Yes, yeah, and where would you go? What emotional communities? I don't know if you got to that bit. Are there emotional communities where confusion is actually not necessarily a feeling of being stuck, but actually quite a useful emotion? I don't know. Yeah, that wonderful, the Keats thing of negative capability. Anyone, other areas where confusion might be quite useful? Okay, or just are there any others? Scientists, yeah, because it might just then propel you onto something else. I was thinking about therapy as well, a therapy space. There's an awful lot of confusion there. Yeah. Yes, yes, great. So actually, I mean, that's a really great example because as a teacher, you're told, it's really important to avoid confusion. So in a way, the emotionology of a university is, to be clear, to explain and to make things straightforward. Whereas, as you say, actually a moment of confusion is hugely significant and important. Okay, great. Let's have one more. Who was it? Someone over there was going to. Yes. Procrastination. Gosh, that's a loaded emotion if ever there was one. Is it even an emotion? I don't know. Go on. So. So that's a good example. I mean, that sort of links back to your artist. You want to be in these moments of suspense or suspended action because that might allow you to do something. But I think you're completely right. That must be true that the instinct that procrastination or being in those suspended states is a bad thing, that must come down back, it must be traced back to the Industrial Revolution and the sense that, especially since the 19th century and the 20th century, that productivity, that as humans, the most useful thing we can do is to be productive at all times. God forbid we have ourselves a little break, eh? Anyway, I think we're done now for the lecture portion of today. So just to briefly summarize, we talked a little bit about what is an emotion. We talked quite a lot about what is an emotion. I was keen to emphasize emotions aren't just reflex responses, but they are shaped by the cultures and environments that we live in. We talked about a couple of examples of the gulf or chasm between the emotions of the past and our own time. So we talked about people yawning for love and dying from nostalgia and fainting from dismay. Then we talked about a couple of examples, one about sadness and one about boredom, to try and understand the kinds of things that might shape what we later learned was called an emotionology. So what might shape the kind of prevailing views of how we value an emotion. So we learned that in the case of sadness, that was partly to do with a fashion for melancholy, and it was partly to do with medical ideas, and it was partly to do with religious ideas. And in the case of boredom, we learned that it had a lot to do with politicians and doctors and a really unpleasant view of poor people. So we learned sort of how those ideas get passed on, and then finally we just looked at some more finely grained ways of thinking about these emotionologies or these prevailing views of emotion. We looked at the concept of emotionology. We looked at emotional communities and tried to understand how we might move between them. And finally, we looked at emotional styles, which gives us an opportunity to think about how people don't just absorb the prevailing emotions, but also can kind of talk back to them and reinvent them and reappropriate them in interesting ways. So now I think it's time for some questions. That's such a great question. So the question is, I don't really know if I need to repeat it, but the question is, can I tell you anything about the history of linking colours to emotions? And the sad answer is no, I cannot, but it's such a brilliant question and such a brilliant area to look at. So it's not something that I've ever looked at. I know that there are historians of colour who are connected with art history, and who may understand a bit about that. I know there are also historians of psychiatry who look at art therapy in my period, which is the 19th century. They look at art therapy in the asylum. So I can imagine, so know what I know about drama therapy in the asylum at that time. For example, patients were advised to avoid certain stimulating plays. So you weren't allowed to do a play about uprisings, for example. You were allowed to do romantic comedies, you know. And so I wonder if there might have been a similar thing at play with colours. Yeah, so how does social media influence or change the language of emotions? So someone here earlier suggested that social media might be an example of an emotional community, which I thought was a really great idea. And I don't know if it's really been studied in that way, but it should be. I mean, obviously, social media has changed, can change emotional landscapes in several ways. So, for example, we get new emotion terms like the wonderful fabbed, but other ones, that come through in memes. So I was thinking about meh. That's from the Larry David from Curb Your Enthusiasm, MEH, and which is I've always been rather fond of. But anyway, that suddenly kind of appeared on lots of memes, and so social media then allows those particular emotional categories to catch fire and enter people's consciousness in a very rapid and powerful way. So that's one way. Another is simply that quite dangerously, in fact, that social media can allow certain emotional responses that face-to-face interactions just don't. So I've spent the last couple of years, a year ago, I spent 2 years working on Schadenfreude. And one of the things about that emotion is that we feel a lot of pleasure when wrongdoers get their comeuppance. And talking to quite a few neuroscientists about how social media works with this, they suggested that, well, of course, when you go online, you see an awful lot of wrongdoing. If you walk down the street, you don't see much wrongdoing, but when you go online, you spend 2 seconds and there's these terrible atrocities all around the world, and you look at your community Facebook group and everyone's complaining about the dog poo and the abandoned mattresses or whatever. And so you are primed then to want to see people punished for these transgressions. And when they are punished, we don't just feel that Schadenfreude, but we also we can feel it in a very low-cost way. Face to face, I'm unlikely to kind of point and laugh when someone is pulled over by the cops for speeding. I'm not going to put myself in that position. I'm just going to put my head down and walk on by because I'm not going to risk getting punched. But obviously, online, there's no risk, is there? So we can gloat and enjoy the spectacle of other people's misfortunes in a very freeing way. So that would be another example of how social media can change emotion in a very practical way. The internet is a different kind of emotional community, and it might legitimize certain emotional responses. It might allow us to gloat over someone's embarrassing gaffe, but it also means that we can enjoy people's comeuppance in a way that won't rebound onto us. Yes, that's a really interesting, and what an interesting way of putting it. And so this is how do emojis change the way we think about or talk about emotions, and this hieroglyphic language, as you put it. I think that's really nicely put. I don't have a simple answer to that. Only that I suppose there have been shorthands for emotional states for some time. I mean, this isn't a unique invention of ours. And, you know, even if it's a shorthand to say, you know, someone wearing black and with a wide-brimmed hat is a melancholy person, which was the sort of fashion for melancholy in the 15th century. And so we do have these shorthands. But I suppose, I suppose one thing is that I'm actually kind of consistently impressed as someone over the age of 40 who doesn't really use emojis. I'm consistently impressed by how many, what variety there is of emojis. You know, I think when I first saw them there was about 5 and I was cross about it. But now there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and my daughter shows me them. And so it does seem like you can get quite a lot of interesting precision in either expressing your emotional state or recognizing a kind of shared investment in a particular hieroglyphic, like a dancer, or, you know. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I don't think emojis are impoverishing our emotional language, which is the thing that some people think they are doing. I do think they allow us to create new modes of interaction. And I do think that, you know, since we do invent emotional words all the time and emotional categories, I mean, what I study is people inventing new emotional words over time and in the present day and in other countries. Since we do that, I don't see why emojis should be any different. I mean, it seems to me to be the same sort of process. That's a great question. That's a really great question. Because yes, it sort of almost reflects that question of emojis, doesn't it? You know, how can a generation which might be very eloquent at engaging emotionally with each other with one language talk to, like, even my generation, who just doesn't really understand what they're going on about, and never mind my parents' generation. I think one of the answers there is to be aware of it. So, for example, I've done quite a lot of work with psychiatrists, and one of the things they tell me is, you know, wow, that's amazing. This is with my work with emotions in different languages. You know, we live in London. It's a culturally diverse city. The people who present to, you know, in acute psychiatry situations are culturally diverse, and yet those doctors are applying a Eurocentric vision of what is a healthy emotional response and what is an unhealthy response to those people, and that is extremely dangerous and limiting and unfair. And they said to me, this particular group of trainee psychologists, like, we don't get taught this, we don't learn about this. And so one of the answers to that is that we need to learn about it. It needs to be in the curriculum, whether that's for psychiatrists or for whoever it is or for university lecturers. We need to understand that an emotional response that perhaps looks bored and disinterested might for that person be stoical and serious. And we need to know that those options exist. And people don't always think about it and they don't always know. So that would be my first thought for that question, is we need to understand those differences. And with the intergenerational question, because that's such a good one. I mean, it's a perennial problem, isn't it? I mean, so much interesting art is written about that gulf between, you know, what your parents think are appropriate feelings and what you think are appropriate feelings. It's such an interesting question. I don't have an instinctive answer to that, only that I suppose just as a historian, you know, when I try and understand what has shaped someone's, I would ask myself what has shaped someone's emotional view, not just, you know, what do their parents like to them, but you know, what sort of conditions did they grow up in? What were the prevailing ideas at that time? and how have they changed into my time, with the recognition that, those can change very quickly. Yes, I suppose it could be, and it is of course unique for each person. You're completely right. We need to recognise the person's individual sort of how that person has been created and what's gone into their background, but also understand the kind of cultural and social forces which have shaped them too. Yes. Yes, good question. This is the question about social engineering and emotions, which emotions fit within the DSM categories as healthy and which ones seem to be aberrations. The DSM and other ways of demarcating what is a healthy and unhealthy emotion, obviously is very contentious and very interesting as a historian, because you get to see when certain emotions come in and out of favour and what is driving that. So I was thinking about the grief clause, which people probably are familiar with. So this is I hope I get this right, this is the change from major depressive disorder, not allowing someone who'd recently suffered a bereavement to be diagnosed as depressed. I think they had to have at least 2 weeks. But now someone who has suffered a major bereavement is allowed to be diagnosed as depressed, which was, as you can imagine, caused a lot of argument and discussion and debate about whether that was fair or not, because some people were saying, well, it is fair because someone who might have been severely depressed in the past might be triggered by this and might need help and medication. And other people say, this is crazy, you can't diagnose bereavements. You can't say that, you can't pathologize bereavement. Anyway, I've slightly got off topic, but I suppose something like the DSM does allow us to see what emotions are, allowed and which ones seem to be problematic. Intermittent rage disorder, I think, is one of the categories in the DSM. It's quite horrifying if anyone ever reads it. You probably do come under that category if you've ever lost your temper and smashed something. So you can see a sort of a sense that anger is being pathologized through the DSM. In a way that we may think is not very helpful, because actually anger, it can be a tremendously useful emotion. It's the emotion that creates political change, it creates momentum, and yet, anger gets sort of, as you say, engineered out of us, perhaps through school, perhaps through the workplace, with this sensation, this sense that we get from the DSM that it is bad for us, that it is wrong. So that was a rather convoluted answer to your question. But yes, basically, I do agree that there is a strong element of social engineering in the history of emotions. And in fact, that is really what the history of emotions is studying, the history of social engineering. That's a really interesting question. I presume that before you get emotions written about, before a certain emotion is written about, I sometimes think that probably that emotion has gone under the radar. So what I'm trying to say is, as far back as we can study, which is really sort of ancient Greek philosophy, emotions are written about a huge amount there. They're absolutely obsessed with emotions. So I think it's unlikely that they had emotion, that there was, like, any emotion didn't have a value, but possibly some emotions didn't have values in that world, if that makes sense. So the ones that don't seem to get debated. So for example, the ancient Greeks are really interested in anger. They're really interested in jealousy and envy. they are interested in happiness, but they don't call it happiness that we would call it today. They call it, something eudaimonia or something, which is much more sort of like a. So perhaps there are certain emotions. What I'm trying to say is perhaps there are certain emotions which don't get articulated because they just don't yet exist as categories, and for that reason, then they don't really have values attached to them, if that makes sense. But that's rather convoluted. I think, as far as we know, as far back as we can go, all emotions are written about, thought about, have values attached to them, and you can understand why. We live in a society. We don't want people to be irrationally furious with each other and punching each other. We do want them to form reliable relationships with one another and be cooperative and share and things like that. So we have to engineer our society to in favour of certain emotions and away from others. Yeah, that's interesting. I think the way it gets described is that you're sort of oversaturated with options, and you kind of give up. But yes, it may not really feel like that anymore, or it might not feel like that to you. It might feel like much more of an emptiness. For me, boredom is like, I could do something, but I just don't really know what to do. So I'm just, it's more like that for me. But anyway, yes. So this is a question about gang crime, and does it involve a lack of emotion, or alternatively, what kind of emotions are involved in that? I mean, to me, as an outsider, I've never studied this, but it seems unlikely that it would be a lack of emotion. It seems to be highly emotional, highly territorial, highly about a sort of, sorry?
The dark side.
The dark side, yes, the dark side, or perhaps about revenge or tit for tat or retaliation. Sense of honour, as I understand it, is quite important. So status and protecting your status. I mean, these are all emotions which have really long histories. But I think it's an interesting question because, in a way, the emotionality of the gang culture isn't what we learn about in the newspapers. I mean, in a way, it is presented as something which almost lacks emotional reality, or lacks emotional credibility, or lacks logic. But perhaps it does have logic, and it does have emotion, and if we could understand it better, then we might understand better what's happening on our streets. And as you say, this is a problem that's getting worse. Well, that's a really massive question. I don't know if I'm really best placed to begin to answer that, but I suppose for my 2 pence worth, to me, I think trying to understand those emotions and how they are playing a part in creating violence, creating a violent retaliation, like trying to understand what are the emotional impulses behind that. That seems really important. And in order to do that, you need to teach young people, as we do in our schools, but maybe we need to do more of it, teach young people to be aware of their emotions, to have emotional intelligence, as we're talking about today. That's a great question. So have I got this right? This is a question about, is this a question about what is the emotion that would define our future? Or is this? Oh, I see, that everyone should feel more of. Is that what you mean? Okay, so what?
It's unanswerable, but
Yeah, it is an unanswerable question. So what emotion would I wish for society to experience more of, or to value more?
yeah.
Compassion, yes.
Ethics.
Ethics. Yeah, compassion, ethics, empathy, respect, humility, morality, peace. Yeah, safety. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Wholeness. Yes. Wholeness, compassion, humility, safety. Yeah, I'll go with all of those answers. I think that's great. Okay, thank you so much for coming. It was really great to talk to you. Thank you.